Have you ever made a decision so reckless, so impulsive, just to protect a heart still healing? Clara Evans didn't plan to kiss a stranger in the middle of a small town fair. She didn't plan to pretend she was engaged to a man she'd just met. But heartbreak can make us do strange things, especially when your ex is watching and smirking. In a town where everyone knows your name and your past, Clara finds herself caught between the scars she's carried for years and the unexpected kindness of a man who should have just been part of the act. But what if pretending starts to feel real? What if the life you thought you'd lost suddenly knocks again, asking for a second chance? Imagine being invited into a family that doesn't trust you, falling for a man who's not supposed to matter, and facing the ghosts of everything you've tried to forget while the whole town watches. What would you choose, safety or love, if you've ever questioned your worth, carried someone else's judgment too long, or wondered if a simple act of kindness could truly change a life? This story is for you. Lean in, listen close. You just might find a little bit of your own heart in Clara's. Clara only wanted to disappear into the crowd, but her ex's smug grin pulled her into the most reckless decision of her life. She'd just finished her late shift at Maple Brew, her apron still stuffed into her tote bag, and the scent of burnt espresso clinging to her hair. The autumn air carried cinnamon and maple, the kind that usually made her smile. But today, it barely registered. Her boots crunched across fallen leaves on Main Street as she wove through the sidewalk fair, half an escape, half a ritual. And then she saw him, Oliver, with his arm slung casually around Whitney Monroe, the local realtor, with a perfect blowout and even more perfect disdain. They were standing by the caramel apple booth, laughing like two people who'd never once shared a bank account or fought over couch colors. Clara's stomach turned. She froze near the cider stand, heart thumping like a drumline. She had promised herself this morning, absolutely promised, she wouldn't let Oliver ruin another fall. She had even written it down in her journal, right next to a doodle of a pumpkin pie and the words, "New season, new spine." And yet, here she was, spine melting like cheap chocolate under his glance. He saw her. His eyes flicked in her direction, and that damn smile spread across his face. Not the kind of smile that greeted old friends. No, it was the kind that said, "I've moved on, and look what I upgraded to." Clara instinctively stepped behind the cider barrel, knocking over a stack of napkins. Ruby, the older waitress from the diner, didn't say a word. She just handed Clara a mug of cider in one of those heavy ceramic cups from the 80s, the kind shaped like a bell and speckled from decades of dish soap and gossip. "Thanks," Clara mumbled. That's when she heard it. "Isn't that your ex?" Whitney's voice dripped honey and vinegar. "The one who used to live in that upstairs apartment with the noisy radiator." Oliver chuckled. "Still wears that old coat, I see. Looks like something from a rummage bin." Clara's face burned. The coat was from a rummage bin, or rather, her mother's old donation box, but it had warmth, memories, and character. Not that he'd ever noticed that kind of thing. Without thinking truly, without a single thread of logic, Clara spun around and locked eyes with a stranger. He stood just a few feet away, tall and composed, leaning one hand against a lamppost like he'd been waiting for a train that would never come. A tailored charcoal coat, pressed trousers, and a half smile that said he'd seen the whole thing. His eyes didn't mock her. They watched, curious. And Clara, her pride howling louder than her common sense, took 3 steps forward. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, louder than necessary. He raised an eyebrow, bemused, and before she could chicken out, she kissed him, just like that, not a peck, not a clumsy bump, but a real, full-mouth kiss, complete with a sharp inhale and the electricity that came from doing something truly, madly out of character. It lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3, and to his credit, he didn't pull away. His hand lightly grazed her waist, steadying her, just enough to make it look real. When she stepped back, breathless and blinking, the fairground had gone eerily quiet in her head. Oliver stood, with his jaw slightly open. Whitney's smile faltered, like someone had unplugged her confidence. "Wow," the stranger said, with a calm smile. That was quite the welcome. Clara tried to say anything, but her words had fled south for the winter. The stranger turned his gaze toward Oliver, gave a small nod like a man acknowledging a checkmate, then turned back to Clara. "Well then," he said smoothly, slipping his hand into hers as though they'd done this 100 times before, "shall we give them a real show?" She could only blink. He looked familiar, not in a local way, but in that "have I seen you on TV" or a magazine cover kind of way. His posture didn't scream Maplewood Falls, more like private jet and black car idling nearby. But before Clara could gather enough thought to ask his name, he leaned in again, as if to whisper something intimate, and instead glanced back at Oliver and Whitney with the faintest smirk. "Let's tell them we're engaged," he said, calmly. Clara nearly choked on air. "You're what now?" What began as a joke over cider has turned into a deal that could change everything for both of them. The bells over the maple brew door gave their usual cheerful jingle, though the wind outside suggested anything but cheer. Clara barely glanced up from behind the counter. Her morning shift had begun with an empty cream dispenser, a coffee maker that coughed instead of brewed, and an older couple debating loudly over whether or not eggs counted as meat. It was barely 10:15, and she already wanted to crawl into one of the booths and hibernate until spring. Then he walked in. Same tailored coat, same calm expression. Nate Whitmore, the man she had, against every rational impulse, kissed in public the night before. And now, here he was, walking into her diner like it was part of his morning routine. Clara blinked. He moved like someone who was used to people watching him. He slid into booth 3, the one under the window, where she'd accidentally spilled hot coffee on a regular last week. She noticed he sat right where the stain hadn't quite come out. Of course he did. Ruby, ever observant and twice as wise, ambled over with 2 menus and a pot of coffee. She didn't even ask. She just poured. "You must be new in town," she said, her voice low and velvety like an old radio. Nate smiled. "Just visiting." "I'm Nate." Ruby glanced at Clara and raised a brow. "Well, Nate, you're sitting in a historic spot. That booth's got some stories." "I bet," Nate said, looking straight at Clara. Clara turned toward the kitchen, muttering something about pie slices. But Ruby caught her elbow in passing. "Be careful with the Whitmores," she whispered. "They don't like surprises." The name landed with a thud in Clara's chest. Whitmore. Suddenly everything clicked: his confidence, the coat, the glint of quiet wealth. The Whitmore family owned half the timberland around Maplewood Falls. They rarely showed up in person, preferring lawyers and agents to do their business. Clara hadn't realized one of them might actually set foot inside her world, let alone kiss her on Main Street. She smoothed her apron and approached the booth. "So, you're Nate Whitmore." He nodded, then leaned back like this was the most natural thing in the world. "And you're Clara Evans, full name, former honors student, waitress, owner of the most impulsive kiss I've ever experienced." Her eyes narrowed. Is that what this is? Some rich guy slumming it for a thrill? No, he said evenly. This is a business proposal. Clara blinked. Nate glanced around, then lowered his voice. My family expects me to bring someone to dinner this Sunday. They've been breathing down my neck about settling down, joining the board, merging life with obligation. I need a buffer. A buffer, Clara repeated. Like a pretend girlfriend-fiancé. He corrected. It'll be more convincing. 1 month, you help me. I help you. She crossed her arms. And what's in it for me? Other than emotional whiplash, Nate didn't flinch. You mentioned looking for a fresh start. I have contacts in publishing. I could get you a lead real work, not pouring drip coffee for people who don't tip. Clara hated how accurate that was. She also hated how her heart beat faster, not out of romance, but possibility. She'd been treading water since the breakup. Maybe this was a way to swim forward. Why me, she asked. You could hire someone better dressed. Someone who doesn't flinch when someone mentions board meetings. Because you didn't know who I was last night, Nate replied. You kissed me without motive. That means something. She rolled her eyes. It means I lost my mind for 2 seconds. Still, he said, holding out his hand across the table. It was memorable. Clara stared at his hand. Part of her screamed to walk away. The other part, the one tired of waiting tables and explaining her resume to people who barely made eye contact, wanted to shake it. She glanced toward Ruby, who was watching from the counter while polishing a glass. Ruby raised an eyebrow, then turned back to her task, like she'd seen this exact story unfold 100 times. Clara slowly extended her hand. Their handshake was brief but firm, the kind that said a deal had been struck between two people who had no idea what they were getting into. Great, Nate said, releasing her fingers. We'll make it believable. Starting with dinner at my parents' this Sunday, Clara muttered. I don't even own a proper dress. The front door of the Whitmore estate opened like the gates to another world, and Clara didn't have a map. She stood at the edge of the stone pathway, heels sinking slightly into the gravel, eyes tracing the enormous white columns rising like sentinels over the entryway. The air smelled of wood smoke and lake mist. Somewhere in the distance, wind ruffled through trees that hadn't quite surrendered all their autumn leaves. The mansion stood regal and still, as if untouched by the winds of time or common folk. Clara tightened the belt on her second-hand wool coat and glanced at the text from Nate again. Don't worry, my mother's bark is worse than her bite. She wasn't reassured. Nate stepped beside her, his breath a visible puff in the fading light. He looked casual in a soft cashmere sweater and gray slacks, but Clara noticed his jaw was set tighter than usual. You okay? He asked, offering his arm. I'll let you know in 2 hours, she replied, linking hers through his. Inside, the Whitmore home smelled like cinnamon pine cones and lemon polish. The floors gleamed, the ceilings soared, and the silence was thick until heels clicked from the staircase. Margaret Whitmore descended slowly, elegance stitched into every seam of her navy silk blouse. Mother. Nate greeted. This is Clara. Margaret gave a tight smile, her eyes doing most of the assessing. Clara, she said, extending a manicured hand. We've heard so much. Welcome. Clara tried to keep her handshake firm, but not eager. Thank you for having me. Douglas Whitmore entered next tall, silver-haired, and wearing a blazer that looked as though it cost more than Clara's monthly rent. He said nothing at first, only nodded and gestured toward the dining room. As they followed, Clara caught a glimpse of the table. A dozen candles flickered against fine china. A crystal bowl cradled a perfect arrangement of autumn branches, and in the center stood a large ceramic turkey, clearly a Thanksgiving preview. "Please, sit," Margaret offered, motioning toward a chair opposite Douglas. Clara eased into the seat, careful not to bump anything. Nate sat beside her, calm as ever, and reached for the cider pitcher. "So," Douglas said, voice smooth but tight. "You're working at the diner." Clara lifted her gaze. "Yes, sir? Maple brew? I'm saving to apply for a graduate publishing program in Portland." He nodded slowly. "An interesting path," Margaret interjected. "Pouring cider? We believe in practical education, hands-on experience. Nate interned at the firm by 19. Clara gave a polite smile. "Hands-on is the only experience I've ever had. Life makes sure of that." A silence passed like a gust through an open window. Nate glanced at her, something flickering behind his expression. Not pride, exactly, but respect. Juliet, seated next to Clara, leaned in and murmured, "You're doing fine." As the meal went on, roast chicken, candied carrots, some kind of citrus-glazed squash, Clara did her best to match their rhythms. She asked questions, listened, smiled at appropriate moments. But there were cracks moments when Margaret's eyes lingered on her thrifted dress, or when Douglas let his fork rest just long enough after her sentence to suggest disapproval. Still, Clara didn't fold. Between the main course and dessert, Juliet discreetly slipped her a folded sticky note beneath the tablecloth. Clara waited until no one was looking, then opened it under the table. "They warm up, slowly, keep smiling." Clara did. Even when Douglas asked if she'd ever dined in a place with more than one fork, even when Margaret described the family's winter charity gala as a bit too formal for small-town guests. By the time dessert arrived, a delicate slice of apple pie, topped with hand-whipped cream, Clara was exhausted from grace. Margaret sat across from her, folding a linen napkin into a swan, then said softly, "You remind me of someone I used to know. She was brave, too." Clara wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a warning. "Thank you," she whispered. Douglas sipped his cider, gaze steady. "Let's see how long she lasts." Nate's hand brushed against Clara's under the table. A silent reassurance, or maybe an apology. Later, as coats were collected and Nate said polite goodbyes, Juliet pulled Clara aside near the entry. "I left Boston," she whispered. "Walked out on the whole legacy thing. It's exhausting being watched all the time." Clara nodded, the comment hanging heavy between them. Outside, the lake reflected a sliver of moonlight. The wind picked up again as Clara and Nate walked down the steps toward the car. Clara didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence said, "I saw them. I heard everything. But I didn't break." And Nate. He opened the passenger door for her without a word. But when she glanced at him under the porch light, he looked at her like he was seeing something, or someone entirely new. Sometimes a handwritten note carries more weight than 1,000 words spoken aloud. The diner had thinned out by the time Mr. Albert shuffled in, wrapped in his olive green wool coat and matching cap, the kind only military men still wore with pride. The wind outside howled like it was chasing something, but inside Maple Brew, the lights were golden, the coffee pots half empty, and the jukebox sat quiet, as if resting after a long day of keeping people company. Ruby noticed him first. "Evenin'. Albert," she called gently. "You out past your bedtime. Mr. Albert chuckled. "Just had something I needed to deliver." He tapped the pocket of his coat, pulling out a worn envelope. This one's for the waitress, who smells like peppermint and never forgets my toast. You know the one. Ruby reached out, already guessing. Clara. He nodded. Didn't know her last name. So I just wrote, Clara from the snowstorm. Figured you'd know? Ruby smiled, a little ache in her chest. I'll make sure she gets it. Clara had just finished drying off the last mug when Ruby handed it to her, soft and discreet. The handwriting on the front was shaky, but sure. Clara from the snowstorm. What's this? Clara asked. Ruby only winked. Open it after the rush. But the rush never came. It was past 8, and the booths were empty, save for 2 truckers, sipping quietly in the back. Clara slid into a booth by the window, unsealed the envelope, and unfolded the letter with careful fingers. The words were uneven, written in blue ink that had smudged in places, but the message was clear. Dear Clara, I never said thank you. That night the storm knocked out the power and my leg went out on me. I thought it was the end. You stayed. You brought a blanket and stayed until the medics came. Even when you could have gone home, you held my hand and told me about your mom's recipe for hot cider. And I don't even like cider. I'm not much for speeches, but I needed you to know I didn't forget. People like you, they don't show up in the paper, but they matter more than most. Thank you for not leaving me alone in the dark. Mr. Albert. Clara blinked rapidly. Her hands trembled just enough that she pressed them into her lap. She hadn't told anyone about that night. It had felt small, instinctual. The kind of thing you did when no one was looking because it was the right thing to do. Ruby had watched from the counter, eyes soft. You okay? Sugar. Clara nodded, though her voice caught. Yeah, just forgot about that night. Funny how kindness finds its way back. Isn't it Ruby took the letter and gently pinned it to the diner's notice board with a heart-shaped magnet shaped like a cinnamon bun. Clara smiled through the shimmer in her eyes. You're gonna make the whole town think I'm some kind of saint. Town already thinks it, Ruby muttered, returning to her mug rack. Later, in the back storage room, Clara was organizing the shelves when she heard the creak of the back door. Nate stepped in, holding a small paper bag. Brought you a slice of that ridiculous cherry pie you love, he said. Figured you might need backup after dinner with my parents? Clara turned, blinking fast, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. Nate's expression shifted immediately. Hey, what's wrong? Nothing, she said, but the shake in her voice betrayed her. Just an old letter. From someone who remembered something I forgot I did. She handed him the copy she'd made of the letter before Ruby pinned it up. Nate read quietly, his brow furrowed, his lips parting slightly. When he finished, he folded the page with deliberate care, setting it back on the crate beside them. You didn't mention this. It wasn't important, Clara whispered. Not in a big way. He studied her face. That's what makes it important. They stood in the quiet a long moment. Boxes of napkins, coffee filters, and extra syrup jugs surrounded them, but somehow the space felt sacred. You keep surprising me, he said, voice lower now. And if you keep doing that... She looked up at him, her eyes still glassy. I might start forgetting this is all pretend. The air shifted between them, not quite heavy, but undeniably different. And just like that, the fake engagement felt less like a plan and more like a question. Neither of them was ready to answer. Understood. I'm now writing Chapter 5 based on your locked Dan, yes sir, D1. Please allow me a moment to craft the full chapter. 1050 words plus 10%, written in a warm, descriptive tone, No headings or structural labels, following all Prompt 5 instructions exactly. What started as a fake dinner invitation is quickly becoming a family event Clara might actually care about. Clara's breath fogged the air as she stepped out of Maplewood Market with a paper bag balanced against her hip. The sharp scent of cinnamon pine cones by the entrance, mixed with the faint hum of holiday carols playing too early over the speakers. She paused, watching an elderly couple sway in front of the canned goods aisle, their slow dance barely more than a shuffle, yet utterly beautiful. The woman hummed softly. The man tapped his foot to the beat of a tune that likely meant something only to them. Clara smiled, her fingers tightening around the paper bag. Inside was the last of what she needed: cornmeal, a worn tin of baking powder, and buttermilk. Her mother's cornbread had always been more than just a side dish. It was the scent of warmth on cold days, the taste of belonging. Her phone buzzed. Margaret's name lit the screen. Clara hesitated, thumb hovering. She still wasn't used to the woman's clipped voice and elegantly veiled criticisms, but when she answered, Margaret's tone was surprisingly light. "You're joining us for Thanksgiving? No excuses." It wasn't a question. Clara managed a polite chuckle. "I've already started prepping." "Excellent," Margaret replied, then added with unusual softness, "We'll see you soon." "Clara?" The call ended before Clara could think of what to say next. Later that afternoon, Juliet met her at her apartment. The place was small, cozy in a mismatched way, filled with secondhand furniture and a patchwork of warm-colored blankets. Juliet flopped onto the couch with a dramatic sigh, then pulled out 2 dress bags like a magician performing a grand trick. "We're finding you something for Thanksgiving," she announced. "Something that doesn't scream, 'I'm faking this engagement.'" Clara laughed, laying the cornbread recipe card gently on the table before them. The old index card had corners browned and curling. The ink faded but still legible. Her mother's handwriting looked back at her like a long-lost voice. "I haven't made this since she passed," Clara admitted. "Feels strange trying again." Juliet sat up straighter. "You should, especially now." They spent the next hour between dresses and stories. Juliet talked about Boston, about leaving behind her cushy job for a quieter life. She admitted she missed the noise sometimes, but not the pressure. "You know," Juliet said, holding a navy dress against Clara's frame, "I think you fit here more than you realize, maybe even more than Nate does." That made Clara pause. She didn't know what she was supposed to fit into anymore. By the time the sun dipped beneath the rooftops, a light dusting of snow began to fall. Clara stood near the window, watching flakes spiral like confetti. She was about to light a candle when there was a knock at her door. "Nate?" He stood there holding a bouquet, not the kind from gas stations, but simple wildflowers, wrapped in craft paper. His expression was sheepish, like even he wasn't sure why he brought them. "I figured you might need a centerpiece," he said, glancing at the cornbread recipe card on the counter. "Or an apology for throwing you into Whitmore family tradition without warning." Clara took the flowers, brushing a stray flake from his shoulder. "You're not supposed to be here until Thursday." He stepped inside. "I'm breaking protocol." They sat, side by side, with mugs of tea that Clara had steeped out of habit. The apartment felt warmer with him in it, though she wasn't sure if it was the tea or something else. "I saw the letter from Mr. Albert on the diner's board," Nate said after a moment. "Ruby made sure I didn't miss it." Clara shifted. "I didn't expect him to remember. It wasn't a big deal." Nate looked at her then. Really looked. "You keep saying that, like the things you do don't matter." She opened her mouth, but words didn't come. Instead, she traced the rim of her mug, the heat grounding her. They sat in that soft silence, a space where something real could begin if either of them reached for it. Clara set the mug down. Juliet thinks I'm starting to fit in here. Because you are, Nate said. She stood, pacing a little. This started as a game, a way to get back at Oliver, to make a few appearances and then disappear again. But now your mom's calling me. I'm baking cornbread. I'm letting your cousin help me pick dresses. It's not supposed to matter, but it does, he said gently. Clara turned, folding her arms, half laughing. I'm scared I'm enjoying the lie too much. Nate didn't move closer, but his voice did. Would it be so bad if it weren't pretend anymore? The snow continued falling beyond the window, blanketing Maplewood Falls in the hush of something soft and waiting. Clara didn't answer. Not yet, but her heart beat like it wanted to. Nothing chills the heart faster than the familiar voice of a past you thought you left behind. Clara didn't expect anything exciting from the book donation drive. It was just another afternoon at the Maplewood Falls Library, peaceful, quiet, with the scent of old pages and floor polish, blending into a kind of comfort she'd come to love. She was helping Juliet organize donations for the upcoming holiday reading program. The light from the tall windows spilled across the hardwood floor like syrup, and wind rattled faintly against the glass. Then the voice came. Well, Clara Evans. Still stacking books and pretending this town suits you. Her back stiffened instantly. She didn't have to turn around to recognize it. Smooth and too sure of itself, dripping with the same arrogance she remembered all too well. Slowly, she turned. Oliver stood there with a stack of hardcovers under one arm, looking as polished as ever in a wool coat and dark jeans that were far too formal for a library event. His smile was smug, like he was proud of interrupting her peace. I'm volunteering, she said, her voice calm. Some of us still believe in giving back. He stepped closer, setting his books down on a table beside her. You always did like to keep busy. Is that what you're doing with Nate Whitmore too, staying busy? Clara's heart kicked in her chest. She narrowed her eyes. You've been listening to gossip. I see. Oliver shrugged. Small town. Big mouths. Can't miss the latest story, especially one involving a Whitmore and a waitress. She turned away, sorting through a box of picture books, pretending her hands weren't trembling. I didn't realize you were back. Visiting family, he said, leaning against the edge of the table. Ran into your friend at the diner. Ruby? Was it? She didn't say much, but her look said plenty. Clara clenched her jaw. And what is it you think you know? Oliver. That it's not real, he said smoothly. That it's some kind of performance. And I gotta say, Clara, it's cute. Really. Playing fiancé to the town's golden boy bold move. Juliet's voice cut in sharply before Clara could speak. Funny. I don't remember asking for your opinion. Oliver turned, clearly startled. Juliet stood behind him, arms crossed, her expression unimpressed. Still throwing stones from glass houses. Oliver, she added, walking forward and sliding between Clara and him like a shield. It's been, over a year since you left. Thought you'd have grown up by now. I'm just surprised, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That's all. Didn't expect Clara to aim so high. Clara took a step forward, and I didn't expect you to still be such a disappointment. That silenced him, if only briefly. Juliet seized the moment. We're done here, she said, taking Clara by the elbow. You've got nothing we want, Oliver, nothing we need. As they walked toward the back exit, Clara could feel Oliver's stare like a prickle on her neck. "I didn't realize how satisfying that would be," she whispered. Juliet grinned. "He deserved it. And you deserved better the moment he walked away." They stepped outside into the chilly afternoon. The late November sun was already dipping low, casting golden light across the sidewalk. Snow from earlier in the week had melted to slush in some corners, but a crisp wind hinted that more was coming. Nate's black SUV pulled up just as they reached the curb. He got out quickly, scanning Clara's face with concern. "Everything okay?" he asked. Clara hesitated. Juliet answered for her. She handled it like a champ. Nate's expression hardened. "That was him, Oliver," Clara confirmed, apparently still stuck in the past. Nate nodded slowly. "Should I go back inside and give him a lesson in manners?" Juliet laughed. Tempting. Clara shook her head. "He's not worth it." As they got in the car, Clara noticed Nate glancing at the brooch on her coat, her mother's silver leaf pin, glinting in the soft light. "He said it looked like something from a thrift store," she murmured. Nate's brow lifted. "He clearly doesn't understand elegance." Clara turned to the window, a smile touching her lips despite everything. "You're good at that," she said softly. "At what?" "Making someone feel like they belong." Back at the library, before leaving, Clara had pinned a small note on the Thanks for Giving board near the front desk, a wall of colorful messages written by townspeople. Kids had scribbled thanks for candy and snow days. Others had left poems or quotes. Clara's note was simple, in black ink, on a torn piece of notebook paper, thankful for second chances. As Nate drove them back through Maplewood's winding streets, lit by early holiday lights strung across storefronts, Clara felt something loosen inside her, a thread of something real pulling at the edges of the pretend. "You okay?" Nate asked again, softer this time. "I am," she said. He kept his eyes on the road. "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone, least of all him." Clara turned to him fully now. "Why do you keep standing up for me because—" He said, "Some people forget how to treat others. And some of us remember what it's like to need grace." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But her fingers brushed the brooch again, and her heart beat a little faster. Maplewood had its ghosts, but it also had new beginnings. Oliver walked away, but not before muttering, "We'll see how long it lasts." The dining table stretched longer than a train car, but Clara still felt like she didn't have a place at it. Outside the tall windows, snow was falling in soft spirals, dusting the evergreens along the edge of the Whitmore estate. Inside, the dining room glowed with golden light from the chandelier and flickering candles. Crystal glasses stood like little crowns at each place setting, and silverware shone against perfectly starched linen. Clara sat near the end, her thrifted burgundy dress blending more with the wood-paneled walls than the gleaming attire around her. She smoothed a hand over her lap, trying not to crinkle the napkin folded with such care it felt sacred. Nate leaned slightly toward her, offering a soft smile, but even that couldn't quiet the voice in her head, reminding her she didn't belong. Douglas cleared his throat from the head of the table. "Let's begin," he said. "As tradition dictates, we'll go around and say what we're thankful for this year." Clara's stomach tightened. She hadn't prepared for this. The Whitmores took even gratitude seriously, one by one. The guests spoke. Juliet toasted to new beginnings. Margaret, in a rare moment of warmth, said she was grateful for family, then looked meaningfully toward Clara. When it came to Clara's turn, the room seemed to pause. Even the fire quieted. "I'm thankful," she began, "for kindness. The kind that shows up when you least expect it." And for my mother's cornbread recipe, which somehow hasn't failed me yet. Nervous laughter fluttered across the table, polite but guarded. Douglas didn't laugh. She was a waitress, he said suddenly, turning toward Clara. That's what you do? Yes. Clara stiffened. Nate tensed beside her. Yes, she said, her voice steady. At Maple Brew. And your parents, Douglas pressed, his tone even. My father was a mechanic, she answered, and my mother worked at the library. They passed when I was 22. Ruby, the woman who runs the diner, took me in, taught me more than anyone else ever has. There was silence. Then Juliet lifted her glass. To Ruby, she said, and to people who show up. Clara smiled, eyes warming. Margaret nodded slightly, as though remembering something, someone. I was once misunderstood, too, she murmured, looking at Clara, then quickly down at her plate. The turkey was passed, along with stuffing, cranberry sauce, in a crystal dish, and a pie, Margaret insisted, had come from a secret orchard recipe. Clara reached for the cornbread she'd made that morning, her hands careful not to shake. When Nate took a piece, he whispered, perfect as promised. Then the front door creaked open. All eyes turned as Ruby stepped in alongside Mr. Albert. The old man looked oddly regal in his thick wool coat and freshly combed hair. Ruby whispered something to Juliet, who gave a small nod. Mr. Albert took a seat at the empty chair beside Clara. Douglas raised an eyebrow. Unexpected guest, he asked to speak, Ruby said, placing a hand gently on Clara's shoulder before retreating to the hallway. Mr. Albert cleared his throat. I won't take long, but there's something I've been meaning to say. Clara blinked, confused. Last winter, he began, during the ice storm, I slipped on my porch and hit my head. Folks didn't know I was missing mail runs, and the roads were frozen over. Most people stayed in, but Clara. He glanced at her, saw my lights off and came knocking. Sat with me until the ambulance arrived. Heated soup on my stove. Never told anyone. Juliet's eyes glistened. Margaret looked stunned. Even Douglas leaned back, lips pressed into a thin line. I'd been lonely that winter. Mr. Albert continued. Her being there, it mattered. Nate reached for Clara's hand beneath the table. His touch was steady, warm. She didn't pull away. Juliet lifted her glass once more. To Clara, she said, voice thick, to Clara. The table echoed, Margaret added softly. And to people who still notice when porch lights go out? Clara's heart pounded. The table no longer seemed quite so long. She excused herself quietly after dessert was served pumpkin pie with hand-churned whipped cream, just like her mother used to make. In the hallway, she found a quiet corner near the fire and pressed her hands to her cheeks, trying to absorb what had just happened. Behind her, the sound of footsteps. Nate. He didn't speak, just stood beside her until she turned. You okay? He asked gently. She nodded. More than okay. I know, he said, and as dessert was served, Nate gently reached for Clara's hand under the table. She didn't pull away. Sometimes the hardest truths come in envelopes that smell like old cedar drawers. Clara hadn't meant to cry that morning. But when Ruby had handed her the envelope with a small smile and said, Mr. Albert asked me to give you this if he forgot. Something in her heart had shifted. She waited until the afternoon to open it, sitting by the window in her apartment with a blanket around her shoulders and a mug of lukewarm tea beside her. Snow brushed against the glass like hesitant fingers. The radio played soft Ella Fitzgerald melodies that made the room feel older, slower. Inside the envelope was a folded letter and an old photograph, black and white, edges worn. Two men in uniform, smiling like the war had never touched them. On the back, written in a hand that had once been steadier, Jimmy Evans and Thomas Albert, 1974. Clara stared at the names. Her father. And Mr. Albert. She blinked hard and opened the letter. Dear Clara, I was going to tell you this in person, but time has a way of slipping by, especially at my age. That winter night when you stayed with me, it wasn't just your kindness that struck me. It was your eyes. They reminded me of someone who once pulled me out of a foxhole and laughed like he'd saved my life doing nothing at all. That someone was your father. Jimmy was the bravest, most decent man I ever knew. He sent letters home about you even before you were born. Said your laugh could quiet a storm. I believed him. We lost touch after he left the service, but I always meant to find you. I suppose I never had the courage. Thank you for bringing a piece of him back to me that night. With gratitude, Tom Albert. Her breath caught somewhere between her ribs. She sat for a long moment, just holding the paper. Her father had never spoken much about the war, just stories about engine grease and loud laughter in the barracks. She hadn't known there was someone out there who had remembered him that clearly, who had carried a photo all these years. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers. Ruby, her voice wavered. I was wondering when you'd call. Ruby answered softly. You got the letter. Why didn't you tell me they knew each other? There was a pause on the line. Because your dad never wanted to be remembered as a soldier. He wanted to be your father, but I always hoped you'd find this when you were ready. Clara looked down at the picture again. He wrote about me. He did. Said you were the best part of his life and the loudest baby on the block. Clara smiled through a tear. That sounds right. She ended the call, folded the letter carefully, and placed it in her keepsake box next to her mother's cornbread recipe, creased and taped at the corners from years of use. She added the photo, laying it gently on top. A knock came at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened it, Nate stood there, holding a pie tin and a brown paper bag. He looked slightly sheepish. Thought you might want some of the leftovers, he said. Clara stepped aside to let him in. The warmth from her tiny apartment greeted him, along with the scent of cinnamon and something older home. He placed the pie on the counter, then noticed the letter in her hand. Bad news. She shook her head. The opposite. Mr. Albert sent me a story I didn't know I needed. She gestured for him to sit, then slid the letter across the table. Want to hear it, I do, he said. She read aloud, voice steady but soft. When she finished, neither spoke for a moment. Finally, Nate said, Your father sounds like someone I wish I'd known. He would have liked you, she replied. Eventually. Nate smiled faintly. So, not right away. He was protective, she said, returning the smile. They sat in the quiet for a few moments, the sound of Ella's voice filling the room like a lullaby. Then Nate leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Clara, I don't think I'm pretending anymore. She looked up, surprised. He met her gaze and didn't look away. I know this started as a way out for both of us. But somewhere between your cornbread and your letters and that ridiculous thrifted coat, I stopped thinking of this as a game. She hesitated, heart beating a little too fast. Then maybe we're both in trouble. Snow quiets a town, but never the noise inside your own heart. Maplewood's downtown shimmered beneath a blanket of fresh snow, the kind that made the street lamps glow a little warmer and footsteps a little softer. The Christmas tree in front of the old post office stood tall, wrapped in ribbons and pine cones, waiting for its moment to shine. But Clara's thoughts weren't on the tree or the town, really. They were on a suitcase, half packed on her bed, and a decision she didn't know how to name. She had told Nate, early on, snowstorms were easier than navigating people, especially people who made you feel things you weren't supposed to feel. Ruby noticed the shadows under Clara's eyes when she stopped by the diner that morning. She didn't say anything at first, just handed over a paper bag of cider donuts and slipped a peppermint into Clara's coat pocket like she had when Clara was 12 and nervous about piano recitals. You know, Ruby finally said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. People always talk about what's fake and what's real. But feelings don't lie, sweetheart. If it's real in your heart, then it's worth fighting for. Clara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes, even if it started as pretend. Especially then, Ruby replied, tapping the side of her mug. Some of the best stories I know started with a lie that turned into something true. Later, as Clara packed her cornbread recipe, her mother's brooch, and the keepsake box with Mr. Albert's letter, she thought about what it meant to leave before being left. It was safer. It always had been. That evening, she bundled up and made her way to the square. The air was sharp, but alive with laughter, with families bundled in coats, children spinning with paper lanterns. The crowd gathered for the annual tree lighting, cocoa in hand, cheeks red from the cold. Nate was near the front, standing by the town mayor and a cluster of volunteers. He looked more formal than usual, a dark coat buttoned up neatly, but his eyes kept scanning the crowd. Juliet nudged him from behind, mouthing something Clara couldn't hear. Clara stood near the edge, next to Mr. Albert's walker, holding 2 cups of cocoa. She handed one to Mrs. Kelly, her old elementary school librarian, who squeezed her hand in thanks. Small-town kindness. It had always soothed her until now, when it felt like another thing she might lose. The mayor tapped the microphone. Before we light this year's tree, we have a few words from someone who's become surprisingly important to Maplewood in just a short time. Nate stepped up. He cleared his throat, looked down at his notes, then folded the paper in half and slid it into his pocket. I came here to escape decisions made for me, he began. To find space, maybe peace. I didn't expect to find this much heart in a small town, or someone who could change how I see it all. He paused. Clara's breath caught. I won't name names, he continued, glancing out at the crowd, but thank you to the people who welcomed me. And to one person who reminded me how real something can feel, even when you don't have the words yet. There was polite applause, then the countdown began. 10, 9, 8, Clara smiled faintly, let the cup of cocoa warm her hands, and quietly began to walk away. The crowd's voices faded behind her. 3, 2, 1. The tree lit up in a burst of color and cheer, but Clara didn't turn back to see it. The path home felt longer tonight, as if each step peeled her further from what might have been. Her apartment was silent when she stepped inside. She closed the door gently, then noticed something on the entry table. A small white box. Hands suddenly unsure, she opened it. Inside was the necklace Nate had given her during their first stage dinner together. A simple gold pendant, nothing flashy, just enough to catch candlelight. She remembered him fastening it around her neck with a chuckle, saying, "Now you look like someone who could fool even my mother." Next to it was a folded note, written in Nate's neat, slanted handwriting. If you're ever ready. Christmas Eve had always meant silence and simple things, but tonight, it was Clara's turn to speak. The snow had started falling just after dusk, not the kind that rushed down in sheets or piled up on doorsteps in an hour, but a slow, steady dusting that softened the streets of Maplewood. Clara stood at her window, watching flakes swirl beneath the lamplight, like they were dancing to a tune only they could hear. Her small apartment smelled like cinnamon and cloves. The radio played softly in the background, Ella Fitzgerald's voice, smooth as a lullaby. On the couch lay a pie she'd baked earlier that afternoon, covered carefully with a dish towel printed with little pine trees. Next to it sat a small ornament box. It was old, faded at the edges, and once belonged to her mother. Clara opened it slowly. Inside were familiar treasures, felt reindeer with crooked legs, a red bulb with her name in gold glitter, and a tiny crocheted angel missing one wing. She smiled, her heart squeezing tight. She hadn't opened the box in years. Maybe because it made her feel too much, or maybe because she hadn't felt anything worth decorating for. Tonight was different. She picked up the little gold pendant Nate had once given her, the one she'd left behind when she walked away. It still held warmth somehow, like it had been waiting for her decision. On the coffee table was Mr. Albert's last letter. His handwriting was a little more wobbly now, but the words were clear. Clara, you didn't just save me that night. You reminded me people still care. That matters. You matter. Tucked inside the envelope was a black and white photo, her father, young and smiling, in uniform, standing next to Mr. Albert, outside a post office. On the back, in tidy script 1974, Before the Snow. Clara touched the image lightly, then folded the letter and photo, slipping them into the small keepsake box beside her mom's old recipes. She pulled on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and tucked the necklace into one pocket, the pie into the other. Outside, the wind had quieted. The snow whispered beneath her boots as she made her way down the sidewalk, past homes glowing with Christmas lights. Maplewood felt hushed, like it was waiting too. When she reached Nate's cottage, she paused at the gate. Light poured from the windows, golden and calm. Through the frosted glass, she could see the faint movement of shadows, the flicker of the fireplace. Her breath puffed in clouds as she walked up the porch steps. Before she could knock, the door opened. Nate stood there, wearing that soft blue sweater again, the same one from Thanksgiving. His face looked surprised, but not shocked, as if part of him had hoped this moment would come. Clara raised her eyes, smiled gently, and held up the pie in one hand and the necklace in the other. I didn't come for the contract, she said, her voice quiet but certain. Or the job. I came because I finally believe I deserve to be loved for real. Nate didn't speak right away. He simply stepped aside and let her in. She passed through the doorway slowly, warmth wrapping around her like a familiar coat. The scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air. Inside, the fireplace crackled gently. On the mantel, a row of pine cones dusted with glitter sat beside stockings, two of them, one unmarked. Clara's eyes lingered there just for a second. Nate turned to her, hands in his pockets. You're sure, he asked, his voice low. Clara nodded. I'm done hiding. From you, from everything. From the window behind them came the soft creak of the porch bench. Mr. Albert sat outside, a wool blanket across his knees. Sipping from a ceramic mug, he looked in and smiled, then raised the mug in a tiny salute before turning his gaze back to the falling snow. Inside, Clara set the pie on the table and pulled the necklace from her pocket. Without needing to ask, Nate took it from her and stepped closer. fastening it gently around her neck. His fingers brushed her collarbone, lingered, then fell away. "You still make me nervous," he said with a chuckle. "That's how I know it's real." She smiled, and for the first time in a long while, it reached her eyes. Nate walked over to the small desk near the fireplace, opened the top drawer, and returned with a small box. No velvet, no pretense, just a smooth wooden case. He opened it, revealing a simple gold band. Inside, engraved in looping script, were the words "Started with a kiss." He knelt not for the show, not because he had to, but because something inside him had shifted too. He looked up, eyes steady. "Let's make this forever. Make this." On a snowy Christmas Eve, what began with a pretend kiss had become something neither Clara nor Nate could fake any longer. The quiet acts of grace, the cornbread recipe, a shared pie, a porch light left on had spoken louder than any grand gesture. Sometimes, it's the hearts we least expect that hold the most room for love. And when we set aside judgment, we give compassion the space to find its way home, like a candle flickering in the window on a winter night. A single act of kindness can guide someone out of the cold. If this story stirred something in you, perhaps it's time to look around someone near you, maybe waiting for that same quiet light. Thank you for being here, and for letting this story find a place in your heart. If it touched you in any way, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life and maybe, just maybe, light up someone's day. Until next time, stay kind and stay connected.